Well, welcome. I am Lori Knitz, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Institute for Faith and Learning here at Baylor. And it is my my sincere pleasure to be convening our panel this morning discussion with Frances Sue and Beth Newman. I first got to know Dr. Sue and Newman when we invited them to be speakers for a faculty development workshop series here at Baylor that IFL began to convene in 2017 called Forming Character in the Classroom. This series grew out of recommendations from a task force that was led by the Vice President for University Mission called Spiritual Life and Character Formation. And I'm happy to say it's continuing and thriving. The workshops are held twice each semester. All Baylor teachers of record are invited. And the workshop's aims are both theoretical and practical as we consider together how character formation in the classroom happens, why it's important, and how we go about it. And all for the purpose of not only fulfilling the university's stated mission, but more importantly, to help our students consider what kind of life might best promote their own flourishing at Baylor and beyond. So over the last 3 years, we have been so fortunate to have some of the best scholars and classroom teachers in the nation and even in the world. We had Simon Oliver here last spring lead these workshops, and Frances and Beth were two of the first. Your work has borne a lot of really good fruit. The workshop attendance continues to grow. We have graduate students asking when the next one will be held. In fact, we had to disappoint some of them and say we weren't going to have any this fall because we were having this big conference and they needed to be here. And perhaps most significantly, we now have a significant number of Baylor faculty who have revised courses, seen their teaching and their students transformed. And so they now lead at least 2 of the 4 workshops every year. And so they're now speaking into their colleagues and into the university life. So we are quietly, and some might say even subversively, changing departments, departmental cultures, and we hope even the institutional culture by giving instructors opportunities to work with colleagues across the university as they think about how their classrooms, their places, their work areas, student life, might be places of character formation without sacrificing academic content or scholarly rigor. So as our IFL team began putting together this conference program, we knew that over these 3 days together, we would be hearing about the what of character formation, the why of character in the university, the character of the university. And we also knew that most of us, at least I can speak for myself, when we begin thinking about the return trip home, begin asking the question, how? How do I do this? How do I implement these ideas in my course or department? How do I make the case to my colleagues, to my chair, to my dean or provost? And we could think of no finer scholars or teachers than Frances Sue and Beth Newman to help us consider that question, how? Frances Sue is the Benedictson Carwab Professor of Mathematics at Harvey Mudd College and the past president of the Mathematical Association of America. He received his BS in mathematics from the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome home, sort of. And his PhD from Harvard University. His research is in geometric combinatorics. I got that out. And applications to this, and its applications to the social sciences. And he's co-authored numerous papers with undergraduates. He also has a passion for teaching and popularizing mathematics. From the Mathematical Association of America, he received the 2018 Halmas Ford Award for Writing and the 2013 Hymo Award for Distinguished Teaching. He authors the popular Math Fun Facts website and is creator of Math Feed, the math news app. His book, Mathematics for Human Flourishing, will be published by Yale University Press this year. Elizabeth Newman is an independent scholar now and was professor of theology and ethics at the Baptist Theological Seminary in Richmond from 2002 to 2019. after serving on the faculty of St. Mary's College at Notre Dame for 12 years. She is the author of Untamed Hospitality, Welcoming God and Other Strangers, Attending the Wounds on Christ's Body, Teresa's Scriptural Vision, and most recently, Divine Abundance, Leisure, the Basis of Academic Culture. She is co-chair for the Baptist World Alliance Commission on Doctrine and Christian Unity and a participant in the Baptist World Alliance conversations with the Pontifical Council for Christian Unity. She is also an associate member of the Epworth UMC, where her husband pastors. So the plan this morning is we will hear individual presentations from both Francis and Beth, have a moderated conversation where they can be in dialogue with each other, and then open the floor for what we hope will be robust and engaging questions and answers from the audience and conversation with these two scholars. So without further delay, please help me in welcoming Francis Sue and Elizabeth Newman.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So I would like to have us think a little bit, and I know you've already been thinking about this question, what is the point of a university education? And how do we make room for human flourishing? And I'm going to argue that even in a field that you normally think of as devoid of humanity, mathematics, or maybe even in the sciences that you don't know, where you don't normally think about issues of character or character formation, that my goal as an educator, even in some of these hard technical disciplines, is to put students on a path towards human flourishing. So what does that look like? I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I've tried to change the conversation within my own field of mathematics about what the purpose of education is, and maybe this will give you some ideas for your own field as well. Now, we're probably all here because we believe that a university education is more than just opening up a student's brain and pouring in knowledge. I think we all hope that we are asking our students to do more than just memorize facts. And our role of educators wouldn't be satisfying if a college degree were simply just an exchange of dollars for vocational know-how. And if we think about it, as teachers, some of our best experiences, most satisfying experiences come when we see students' lives change, when we see students' lives transformed. And so this idea of transformation moves a student from being a passive observer to an active participant in their learning. And this transformation happens when we shape the character of the students, how they think, how they behave, and how they learn. But transformation is not the way we often speak of education, is it? Right? More often we speak of skills, training our students for a 21st century workforce. We talk about success and whatever that means. We talk about what students, quote, need to know, as if knowledge were enough to equip students for tomorrow's challenges. And so education runs the risk of becoming transactional rather than transformational. And my own field of mathematics is often seen this way. If you're a math teacher, you've probably seen some version of this meme, which is a version of the question, when will I ever use this? What is this good for? Why am I learning this? And that really is the question. It begs this question. Why do mathematics? Right? Do you learn math simply to make you, quote, college and career ready, end quote? Or is math simply for the elite few? Right? Even I know many college professors who might implicitly, if not explicitly, say that the point of getting a math major is to train people to get PhDs, right? That's a version of this message. Math is only for the elite few. And so when people ask this question, when am I ever going to use this? What they're really asking is, when am I ever going to value this? And they're equating value with utility because they haven't seen that they can value anything more. So if you ask me, why do mathematics? I would say this. It's because mathematics helps people flourish. And it does so by building in us virtues that serve us well no matter where we go in life, no matter what we do. And I like to think of virtues as excellence of character that leads to excellence of conduct. So it includes more than just moral virtues. For instance, patience, courage, these are also virtues. And in my own field of mathematics, I see math as building certain virtues, like, for instance, persistence, curiosity, clear thinking. These are all built by the practice of mathematics, and they help you live life well, even in challenging circumstances. And that's part of what it means to flourish. Human flourishing is not just happiness, it's not just a state of mind. It is living life well, even in challenging circumstances. And I like this framing of thinking about mathematics as being for human flourishing because it doesn't matter what kind of institution you're at, whether you're at a secular institution or a religious institution, we can all get behind this idea of helping our students flourish. And I have to say that even though I'm a professional mathematician, I've been teaching for 20 plus years now, it's only been relatively recently that I've been actually challenged to think about how it is I teach. And if I really believe math is for human flourishing, which I do, and I have believed for a long time, does my teaching actually reflect this? Does it change the way I teach? And if you look at some of my exams or assignments, you'll see pretty standard question. They test knowledge or they test skills. But any attention to virtue is only there implicitly, right? Maybe in proving solving a problem by induction, I'm asking them to show their skills in clear thinking, right? But it's not somehow assessed explicitly. So these are some of the questions that I've been thinking about, wrestling with, even just recently in thinking about this framing. So I've had a unique opportunity recently to talk about and shape the conversation about human flourishing in my profession. As president of the Mathematical Association of America, I gave a speech in January 2017 to the association at our annual meeting. And when I started thinking about what I wanted to talk about in this speech, which is sort of an outgoing speech you give at the end of your term, I didn't want to just give another math talk. That would be a pretty standard way to, a standard thing for, as past practice would have dictated. I thought it would be, I think, more important and valuable to start a conversation about why it is we do what we do as mathematicians, as educators, as people who shape the lives of students in their, no matter what profession they go into. And so I decided to center my speech around basic human desires. These are all themes like play, beauty, truth, justice, love. You'll recognize these in some ways as even spiritual themes. And I talked about how math meets these desires, and in doing so, builds certain virtues, habits of mind. And I guess I didn't expect the speech to actually necessarily resonate with a bunch of mathematicians who all of us have been trained to teach mathematics we haven't been trained to teach mathematics in thinking about some of these things. But the speech struck a chord with the audience. I think partly it's because I think all of us, first of all, we're attracted to doing mathematics because of some of these virtues. But all of us, I think, feel like there is something more to education than just pouring in knowledge and having people build skills. I think also at the time there has been a deep discomfort with the way mathematics is portrayed the way mathematics people often think about the math profession and what it's for. And so I think people were thinking deeply about some of these things already. The need for justice in who has access to mathematics, for instance. It's become a topic of a lot of concern in the math community. And so the fact that this speech struck a chord with people showed me that there really is a need, even among professional mathematicians and scientists, to talk about our longings for the common good and ways that we need to be better human beings, not just better mathematicians. So I thought I'd just share with you a couple of different basic human desires and how they lead to mathematical ways of expressing virtue. And one basic human desire is exploration. So when I was a child, I loved the stars. I grew up in a small town in South Texas. This is a small rural town, Kingsville. And this was a place you could actually see stars, unlike where I currently live in Los Angeles, where people don't even know what a star is. Well, they know the Hollywood variety. And so far from any big city, I could see even the dimmest stars. And I begged my parents for a telescope, but they didn't have the money. And so I just devoured books about astronomy, and I dreamed about space. And my childhood imagination was stoked by the journeys of the Voyager probes throughout the solar system, and I saw pictures like these in the newspapers. Exploration is a deep human desire, and it's a mark of human flourishing. And I could explore these worlds even from a small little town in South Texas, 900 million miles away. Mathematical exploration is like space exploration, but a different kind of space, a space of ideas. You don't know what you'll find when you start. You send out probes to test theories. You're captivated by mystery. You're motivated by questions. You're undeterred when you hit a setback. And you make discoveries from a distance, right? The ideas themselves are not physical, and because of that, you access this space through reason. And exploration is at the heart of what it means to do mathematics. You don't need a lot of resources to become a mathematical explorer. And as a result, you can embark on an adventure from anywhere, even from a small rural town like mine. And exploration cultivates virtues like imagination and creativity. In order to solve problems, you have to ideate new possibilities. Mathematical explorers look at the world and they like to dream up new ways of visualizing patterns. Right? If you think about some of the major innovations of just even the last 20 years, they're the result of people thinking mathematically, visualizing patterns, the hidden structures that underlie all that we do. That's what is happening when your GPS is finding the best way, the best route to a location. It is looking at underlying patterns. And mathematical explorers equip these algorithms to do that. Patterns are everywhere, and we use our imagination to see them and to understand them. And mathematical explorers fashion creative ways to think about these hidden structures that underlie the world that we live in. And creativity is a central part of what it means to do mathematics. That's not a view of mathematics that many people have seen in their education. And exploration cultivates in us the expectation of enchantment. That's a virtue. Explorers are excited by the thrill of finding the unexpected, especially things weird and wonderful. It's why hikes through unfamiliar terrain entice us. It's why unexplored caves beckon to us. Why the strange creatures of the deep sea ocean floor are fascinating to us. What else might be lurking down there? And in math, it's the same way. When we take, this is what's called a fractal Menger sponge, with lots of little self-similar squares and cubes all over, and you slice it diagonally, and then find a bunch of hexagonal stars, we're surprised. We're enchanted. We ask that most basic human question. Why? What just happened here? And if you begin to look at mathematics and explore mathematics in this way, we learn to expect enchantment around every corner, which makes math exciting to learn. And so we'll keep coming back for more. Right? People don't do mathematics because they want to do long worksheets of multiplication problems. But isn't that the impression that some of you have gotten in your education as a student? What would it look like for us to learn to expect enchantment around every corner? If you think about math as just memorizing things and not making sense of things, of course you're going to think it's dull and boring. And so at every opportunity, we need to counter the idea that math is memorization and replace it with the idea that math is exploration. A math memorizer doesn't know how to react in unfamiliar situations, but a math explorer can flexibly adapt to changing conditions. Another basic human desire is play. Now, if you think about all the various kinds of play that you engage in, sports play, musical play, beach play, word play, one of the first activities we engage in as babies, beyond survival activities, is play. If you think about what defines play, it's really not so easy to define, but you can think of a few qualities that characterize play. For instance, play ought to be fun. Otherwise, it wouldn't be play. But there's usually some kind of structure, like the rules of a game or musical chords. Right, but there's a lot of freedom within that structure, right? That freedom leads to some sort of exploration. In jazz, it's called improvisation. That's the exploration. In sport, the exploration happens when you play the game, and it unfolds in many different ways depending on the day that you play. Play is often whimsical. There's no great stake in the outcome, but there's some sort of surprise often, like a discovery or a satisfying pun in wordplay, or a thrilling end to a football game. Now, of course, animals engage in play as well, but what characterizes human play is the enlarged role of the mind and the imagination. So if you think about any game that you might play, whether it's a game like Set, by the way, how many people play this game, Set? It's a very, very mathematical game in some ways. And often, kids play it a lot better than adults. But they're engaging in mathematical thinking. There's an interplay between structure and freedom. There's a delight in finding sets of matched cards. And mathematics makes the mind its playground, right? We play with ideas, we play with patterns, we explore what's true, and we enjoy the surprises that arise along the way. There's even a whole area of mathematics, did you know, called recreational mathematics. Recreational mathematics. Is there another field that has a subfield that's recreational? Don't say it. Don't say it. My chemistry friend said, well, there is recreational chemistry. And math play builds on us virtues. Builds in us virtues that enables us to flourish in every area of our lives. For instance, math play builds hopefulness and concentration. When you sit with a puzzle long enough, you are exercising hope that you'll eventually solve it. And guess what? That virtue serves you well for the next problem, even if you don't solve the current problem. Hopefulness. And this, sadly, is not something that everybody experiences in mathematics or experiences in their life, right? The hope that problems can be solved. And part of what you're helping people realize is, yes, there is hope that you can solve problems, and you can activate your mathematical identity and learn that problems can be solved. Math play builds in us the ability to change perspective. Just like in gameplay, when you analyze a situation from multiple points of view and imagine possibilities, you do the same thing in mathematics as well. Math play builds perseverance. Just as weekly soccer practices make us more fit for the next game, weekly math investigations make us more fit to solve the next problem. Play is part of human flourishing, and you can't flourish without play. So as we learn math, we need to make room for questions, investigations, surprise, imagination. I like to de-emphasize the role of grades in my class as just a measure of progress, but not a measure of promise. Too many people think they get a bad grade on a math exam, and then they rule themselves out of math forever. Oh, I'm not a math person. They'd be surprised to learn how many mathematicians, professional mathematicians, have gotten low grades on math exercises, worksheets, right? We like to joke that we're not calculators, right? Play is such an important part of human flourishing. Let's make math playful and not a performance sport. So those are just a couple of ways that I'm learning to see some of what I do as meeting basic human desires, things that attract any of us to do any of the things we're passionate about. So as Lori mentioned, I've been working on a book for much of the past year that explores these ideas. In fact, every chapter is sort of centered around a basic human desire, like a desire for meaning, a desire for beauty, a desire for truth, a desire to struggle, a desire for freedom. And these, believe it or not, are all met in some ways through the practice of mathematics. Wouldn't it be great if people began to see mathematics in this way, as a vehicle for human flourishing? And each of these basic human desires, when you pursue mathematics in this way, leads to certain kinds of virtues. These are just some of the things in the book that I discuss. Desire for truth leads to a thirst for deep knowledge and deep investigation. And you learn this when you realize that shallow knowledge in mathematics leads you astray. Like, how many of us have had the situation where we don't understand what we're doing and we just follow some recipe, we get a wrong answer, and we're frustrated? Well, guess what? That frustration actually is an entry point into learning to understand things deeply, right? These things lead. A quest for meaning in mathematics leads to a very important skill, a virtue, of being able to build stories. Story building, right? It's such an important skill. I know some of you are like, what? Story building in mathematics? But it happens in mathematics just like it happens in lots of other disciplines. A desire for community in mathematics leads to excellence in teaching and mentoring and disposition to affirm others. This is one of the ways I think, teaching is often neglected by people who think only about mathematics as doing research. But if you think about mathematics as serving larger human goals, then you'd think about the proper place of mathematics as including the virtues like excellence in teaching and mentoring. Anyway, so I think one of the messages that I want to drive home here in your own field and as well as in mine is to emphasize virtues, not just knowledge and skills. One of the ways that I've sought to do that now in recent years is asking this question, asking students to reflect. I realize that many of my assessments don't measure the things I think are important. And so if I value virtues, why not get my students to reflect a little bit about some of those virtues? So here are some of the questions I've asked my students: to reflect on beautiful patterns, to describe what they've learned in this class about the process of doing and creating mathematics. And when has the process of struggling and not finding an answer been valuable to you? I just recently wrote a textbook in math, and don't worry about the math in here. But what I want you to notice is Because of some of this recent thinking, I've also then decided it's not only important to call out the math, but also call out the effective thinking principles that you are learning through the practice of this subject. And so here, some of the effective thinking principles: seeking different views of the same result. Draw a picture. That's something mathematicians often tell our students. Draw a picture, see if understand what's going on. Imagine alternative worlds. Look at examples. Start with simple cases. And so anyways, just to end here, then my hopes here are just to think about my own practice in mathematics as cultivating virtues that transform an individual towards human flourishing. How do you connect your discipline to the deep human desires that motivate us? What are the virtues that are built as a result? You see, 10 years from now, you're probably not going to use any of the math that you learned in grade school. Think about the innovations that happen today. The math of many of the things, mathematics in the iPhone didn't exist 20, 25 years ago, right? But what were we building our students? What were we doing with our students 20 years ago? We weren't just building in skills, we were building in virtues that enable some of the greatest innovations to happen currently. I'll just finish then with, I'll show you an example of what one of my students answered with the question about struggle. What have you learned about struggling in this class? And here's what he said. I know that learning to do something with your hands is probably the equivalent to struggling to do something academically. For example, when I was 10, I taught myself to juggle, and I got really good at it. I stopped juggling once I realized it wasn't cool. But 15 years later, I was able to shock my wife with this hidden skill, but I realized I could still do it. Similarly, and this was from a former Marine, a lot of the skills I learned in the Marines required me to perform some complicated action with my hands or body. I'm pretty sure I will always remember how to disassemble and assemble any crew-served machine gun. Similarly, shooting is something I spent years doing. I'll probably always be good at it till my body stops working. I should just mention this Marine, he's come back to school. So he's like 10 years older than all his students, his fellow students, right? So he was experiencing a lot of anxiety about coming back and not living up to his potential. So he continues, I look at math professors effortlessly solve problems on the board, even if they didn't initially remember how to do the problem. I've seen you do this at least a couple of times when a student asked a good question. I think that for you, math is a lot like fixing a car or putting something together without instructions. You have struggled so much that all previous experiences are burned into your brain. You simply cannot forget things that easily anymore, and because of this, you're just better at math because you put in the time and hard work. And I'm hoping that I can get to that level with some subject someday. I think he will, right? He's learning the virtues that are associated with struggle, a productive struggle that will lead him towards human flourishing. Thank you very much.
Okay, I want to thank the Institute for Faith and Learning for inviting me to be a part of this really wonderful conference. It's great for me to be back at Baylor and to reconnect with some very good friends and to meet some new ones. So in my talk, I'm going to focus on leisure as the basis of academic culture. And I want to start by providing a theological framework that helps us make sense of what true leisure really is. And then I'm going to use that to engage it more in thinking about the classroom. To imagine leisure as an escape is a mistake. Indeed, such an understanding is a distortion of true leisure. One might even say it is an heretical understanding. Joseph Pieper in Leisure, the Basis of Culture, in fact, makes a surprising claim that no one who looks to leisure simply to restore his working powers will ever discover the fruit of true leisure. To develop this, Pieper turns to the vice sloth, or acedia, which he sees as the besetting sin of modernity. Despite beliefs to the contrary, Pieper denies that sloth is the same thing as laziness. Rather, laziness is a symptom of sloth, but an equally, if not more prevalent symptom, especially in the academy today, is busyness. Thus, the workaholic and the indolent alike are incapable of true leisure. Rightly understood, sloth is a despairing refusal to be oneself, to be who one is before God. According to Pieper, then, leisure requires a receptive attitude, a contemplative attitude. It is not only the occasion, but also the capacity for steeping oneself in the whole of creation. Leisure thus leads one, says Pieper, to see and accept, quote, the reality of creation. Underlying his analysis is a certain understanding of being, an ontology. Our being, as well as the being of the whole cosmos, is not neutral. Being is itself communion with God, in which all that exists is related to God and has its end in God. He quotes Aquinas, the divine wisdom is always at play, playing throughout the whole world. So understood, then, leisure is a reception of being as communion, an openness to divine wisdom, and a willingness to delight in creation. Leisure pertains to all knowing, and so is a way to discover how various disciplines and knowledges are a part of divine wisdom. In sum, leisure is not rest from work in order to be more productive. This utilitarian understanding is rather a profound sign of an institution's despairing refusal to be itself. Rather, leisure is the goal of work, not as some means-end calculation, but as the purpose of work, which is participation in divine wisdom. So, some objections. First is the concern that leisure, while important, does not really belong in the classroom. It sounds like prayer or worship, and Pieper says worship is, in fact, the spring of true leisure. These activities, one might object, belong in the extracurricular sphere of the institution. Leisure, as I'm describing it, sounds like one is mixing faith and knowledge. A second and related concern has to do with those who do not accept the theological convictions that undergird such leisure. Should one impose these in a classroom setting? The reality, however, is that institutions are always sustained by some kind of faith. The key question is not where does faith belong, but rather which faith is in fact already guiding an institution. The faith that dominates the academic landscape today owes a profound debt to Gnosticism. At least three key Gnostic convictions are antithetical to true leisure. First, for Gnosticism, being is not intrinsically good. It is not created by a good God. And being does not, as Irenaeus states, depend for its existence on God's power and art and wisdom. Secondly, Gnosticism places spirituality in a separate sphere from the material order. A Gnostic spirituality or a Gnostic leisure seeks to escape the dreary world in which one is trapped. Finally, Gnosticism is a thoroughly rationalistic movement. Salvific gnosis or knowledge has to do with the mind rather than with material being. Consequently, a Gnostic may be an ascetic or a libertine. It survives and even promotes an unending plurality of values. Gnosticism, then, has no resources to see the material world as a place of communion, where, as Walter Rauschenbusch once stated, even the common thorn bush is aflame with the glory of God. To return to an earlier objection, an ontology of communion, in contrast to a Gnostic ontology, actually allows for greater freedom in relation to those of different faiths. This is because freedom is not a flight from the world, nor primarily individual choice. It is about becoming the kind of person and institution one is created and called to be. To live into being as communion is to see the other as well as oneself as gift, as participants in God's own giving and receiving. Diversity, so understood, is not relativism. It is rather a reception and participation in the love and wisdom of God. Irenaeus describes this as a great symphony. Quote, created things in their great number and diversity fit beautifully and harmoniously into the creation as a whole. The same artist was responsible for the wisdom, justice, goodness, and munificence of the whole work. So, moving towards the classroom. We can say about leisure and the classroom what McIntyre says about ethics. The first question is not, what am I to do? One can only answer that, McIntyre says, when one has answered the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part. In what follows then, I want to look at how three virtues can help sustain the story of leisure and of being as communion in the classroom. So the first is leisure and paying attention. The American poet John Ciardi states, we are what we do with our attention. Academic institutions easily justify their existence today against the bar of usefulness. For all the lip service paid to diverse values and the encouraging of critical thinking, the modern academy easily serves one purpose, to prepare the student to compete. This is true not merely for those who publish or perish. It applies equally to those who must take part in the global economy as lawyers, MBAs, or software engineers. Simone Weil, however, in her well-known essay, Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies with a View to the Love of God, argues against this utilitarianism by focusing on the habit of paying attention. Such attention is not about mustering willpower, contracting one's brows, or holding one's breath, as one might do when a teacher says, pay attention. It is rather learning to pay attention to the right things in the right ways. And they focuses particularly on waiting. Paying attention, she says, is an active waiting, as when one waits for the right word to come at the end of a pen. She emphasizes we do not obtain the most precious gifts by going in search of them, but by waiting for them. Way reverses then a utilitarian approach to learning. One does not study merely to secure an extrinsic goal. One studies to become a particular kind of person. Paying attention, even to failure, allows for growth in humility, which, Vey says, is a far more precious treasure than all academic progress. Or to know a geometry solution as a precious gift is to receive it as a sign of something greater, a living truth. Vey thus claims every school exercise thought of in this way is like a sacrament. Apart from this kind of paying attention, knowing will easily degenerate until the cosmos becomes dumb and blind, like a machine of which we are masters. Vey's understanding could seem ideal and irrelevant to the real world of work and competition. But what is the real world? Leisure, as paying attention with a view to the love of wisdom, enables learners to see the world as it really is. One story that captures leisure and the reception of gift is Tolstoy's God Sees the Truth But Waits. In this story, a Russian man, Aksionov, is found guilty of a murder he did not commit. For 26 years, writes Tolstoy, Aksionov lived as a convict in Siberia. His hair turned white as snow and his beard grew long. All his myrrh went. He stooped, he walked slowly, spoke little, and never laughed. And he often prayed. He learned to make boots, earned a little money, and bought the lives of the saints. Over the years, both the guards and fellow prisoners came to admire his meekness and his wisdom. One day, the man who really committed the crime shows up in the same prison. As Aksionov thinks about all he has lost, his wife, his children, his earlier life, he longs for vengeance, even if he himself should perish. Yet, in the end, he says to his enemy who is pleading for forgiveness, God will forgive you. Maybe I am 100 times worse than you. And he has the opportunity to leave, but he doesn't. And Tolstoy writes, at these words, his heart grew light. Through waiting, paying attention, Aksionov becomes holy, forgives his enemy, and grows in love. Such transformation would have been impossible in a Gnostic version of this story, since Gnosticism sees time as that from which we must escape, or that which we can do with as we please. But time, for Aksionov, becomes a participation in God who joins past, present, and future, so that his sins no longer bind him, and he is free to participate in God's love and truth. God sees the truth but waits, and so does Aksionov. Bay's understanding of paying attention enables one to see classroom time as not simply our own. While time is linear, it is also a participation in God who joins past, present, and future, and as such is a place of waiting for gifts, even more than searching for them. Time, then, is not a neutral category, but a theological one. There are always liturgies guiding the classroom, even if only implicitly, as James Smith, has argued quite powerfully. If some liturgy is always at play, then Bay's analysis calls for paying attention to receptive and contemplative time in the classroom. This might include prayer. It might include contemplation. It might include lingering before an object or text in expectation of a gift. Secondly, leisure and courage. Pieper states, wonder does not make one industrious, for to feel astonished is to be disturbed. It's one of my favorite quotes. Why does wonder disturb, or how does wonder disturb? One way is the realization that something is out of order, or that being as communion is broken. True leisure calls for courage in the face of disorder and disordered ways of living. One story about leisure and courage is the film Of Gods and Men, a 2010 French drama film that centers on 9 Trumpist monks, it's a true story, who lived with a largely Muslim population in Algeria. The monks served the surrounding community through teaching and medical care and come to form deep friendships with their neighbors. As the Algerian civil war becomes more threatening, both the government and their friends and family urge them to leave. The film depicts their intense struggle and disturbance of the men in an increasingly violent situation. Yet, through their contemplation, their leisure, in conversation, at meals, at worship, while visiting with their neighbors, they see that their communion with others and God is calling them to stay, and they are eventually kidnapped and killed. As the monks exemplify, courage is the ability to be faithful in the face of sometimes overwhelming opposition. The rhythm of their daily lives, caring for the land, praying together, eating together, caring for their neighbors, all a participation in divine love, leads them to a courage they could not have known they possess. Certainly, courage for each of them was already displayed early on in their willingness to live and work in Algeria and not be in a sort of normal, productive members of society. Practicing leisure in the academy requires courage precisely because it goes against the dominant emphasis on productivity, on you are what you do. As such, however, I guess I should say, it might sound flaky, like navel gazing or even wasting time. But it can take courage to stand still, to apparently, do nothing. I mean, the monks could have done something more active, and they didn't. As Milton says, they also serve who only stand and wait. A Gnostic apocalypticism easily wants to destroy the world and all that has come before, which is because it's the prison of spirit. The monks refused this option and courageously stood still. So, there's a practice called statio, which means standing still, or staying still. And it's a practice that in ancient times was practiced by monks before they went in to pray. So it was like 5 minutes giving over to just waiting. Or station comes from the word standing still. So the stations of the cross, which in the Catholic tradition is where you go and you stand before the images of the cross. You're standing still as a time to not just rush from one thing to another, but a time of receptivity. And I think that is a practice that we could incorporate in our classes as a way of embodying more leisure more fully, standing still before moving from one activity to another as a way to be open and receptive. Finally, leisure in the classroom and the academy requires the virtue of hope. Samuel Kimbrell, in Friendship as Sacral Knowing, develops an understanding of the self as porous, in contrast to the disengaged self who believes he or she can acquire knowledge as his own through self-mastery. So porous self versus a sort of closed-off self. Underlying the porous self receives knowing as always a gift of communion with wisdom, with God, with others. Underlying this, says Kimbrell, is the conviction that the deepest contours of reality are those defined by divine love, whether that be within God himself or is displayed in creation. Yet, as we know, isolation and fragmentation, rather than the contours of love, easily mark the modern academy. Stanley Fish, who is sympathetic with those who seek to restore the soul of the university, nonetheless holds out little hope. As he said in an exchange with Marston, we already had the Enlightenment and religion lost. The loss of the university soul, he says, even more poignantly, is not simply a matter of historic fact. It is inscribed in the very consciousness of those who live in its wake. Isaac Denison's story, Babette's Feast, can serve as a parable of leisure and hope in an otherwise diminished community. In this story, Babette, a famous Parisian chef, becomes a refugee after her husband and son are killed. Eventually, two poor Danish women allow Babette to live with them as a cook. The Danish women are part of a community who, as Denison writes, have renounced the pleasures of this world, for the earth and all that it held to them was but a kind of illusion, and the true reality was the New Jerusalem toward which they were longing. So they're very sort of puritanical. Despite this otherworldly focus, the community becomes caught in memories of past injuries, quarrels, and destroyed friendships. So 14 years pass, and Babette, the chef, comes into some money and decides to fix an extravagant meal for the community. Well, they are horrified and suspicious of the wasting money. Despite their misgivings, the Puritans go along with Babette's plan, deciding ahead of time that it would be improper to react to her extravagance. Their reluctant participation in Babette's meal, however, draws them into a world of grace and forgiveness. Grudges and resentments melt away, and in a final scene, they are singing and dancing under the night stars, united with each other, but even more with all of creation. The supper, song, and dance in response to divine love is an image of leisure and hope. The story, while about a small community in Denmark, nonetheless helps us to imagine how leisure and hope can shape the classroom. One might easily have thought that the Danish community would never change. The resentments too long in the blood, their focus on an otherworldly quasi-Gnosticism, far too embedded in their way of life. Yet in the end, divine abundance triumphs over scarcity. While this is a profound mystery, the transformation is made possible by Babette's loving introduction to another way of being in the world. Ordinary acts of cooking, eating, singing become extraordinary means of grace. While the classroom is different from Denmark, obviously, it is nonetheless still an ordinary place. And Babette, I want to say, introduces what I would call a sacramental way of being, one that Irenaeus would have embraced. The flesh is the hinge, he wrote. The material world, in all of its complexity, frustration, blindness, and even apparent hopelessness, is nonetheless the world where Christ is. So understood, the virtue of hope reminds us that leisure cannot be secured by technique, but it can be practiced in ordinary places with a view to the love of God, and in so doing, sustain the classroom and academy as a place of divine abundance. Thank you.
Thank you both. Okay, so I'm going to ask just maybe time for one question for you guys to engage in dialogue, and then we'll open up to Q&A. So this was intentional. You guys have been set up, but you represent, generally speaking, the arts, the humanities, and sciences through your respective disciplines, mathematics and theology and ethics. So let's suppose you were speaking to the other half of the university, and I know theology is the queen of the sciences. So anyway, yeah, but
Nice.
what would you want colleagues, chairs, deans of the other half of the university, if we want to divide it that way, to know about the unique opportunities and challenges of thinking about virtues in your particular disciplines? Like, what do you think you would want to say to the humanities profs or the mathematics profs? So.
I think one of the great advantages of thinking about the university as a place of formation is that we're able to challenge some of the ways formation has been going on in the university and the modern academy. And one of those formations has been to see that knowledges are often siloed off from each other, so that you're teaching. I might be teaching theology here, or when I was teaching at St. Mary's College, I used the Bishop's Letter on Economic Justice, but it wasn't a part of the economics world at all, because they hadn't really been. It hadn't been in their frame of thinking. So I think that if we think about we're participating in a wisdom larger than ourselves, then together we can explore certain kinds of questions and use those as ways to engage one another. And I think particularly, I'll just give an example, Michael Hamby, I can't remember the title of his book, but has written a wonderful book on creation and science, where he's doing exactly that kind of integration across the board.
Just to add to that, I think this idea of integration is something that we often expect to hear from humanities professors, but not so much from scientists. And so I guess my message to those in the humanities is to enlist the help of scientists to support what you do. I mean, I think you'll find allies in the sciences who will say the humanities is really important, and you'll be able to tell by some of the ways they talk and speak about even their own profession, and so I guess that would probably be the biggest thing I would say is enlist the help of scientists to elevate the work that you do. And then in the other direction, support thinking about the sciences as an avenue of finding truth. And it's approaching the study of truth in a slightly different way. I think there's ways to mutually reinforce that synergy.
Okay, thank you both very much. Well, let's open up the floor for conversation. There are mics at the end of each aisle, and come forward with any question that you might have, and we'll devote some time to Q&A.
Thank you both for some marvelously provocative talks. My question is about the concept of enchantment, which I think both of you touched on in some interesting ways. There's been a lot written about enchantment and maybe its place in scholare, in leisure, and its relationship to secularization. The idea sometimes being proffered that secularization has de-enchanted the world. Whereas in my view, I think technology may be in the process of re-enchanting it in a different way. The enchantment of an Apple store, for instance, is remarkable. The enchantment that's possible through human augmentation in the coming decades, I think, will be very attractive to large portions of our human population. So here's my question for you as educators. Is one kind of enchantment more virtuous than another? Are there some kinds of enchantment or being excited about the possibility of opening up academic inquiry? Or are there different kinds of enchantment that some of which may be more character forming and some of which are not? It's possible for me to imagine being enchanted without being virtuous. So how would you, what are your views on that topic? Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. In my, well, I wrote a book on hospitality a while back, but when my children were younger, and I talked about they were so enchanted by the McDonald's Happy Meal. It drove me nuts, you know. and then it pulled them into the whole Disney enterprise, you know, and then into the whole thing. So I think there's definitely good and bad ways to be enchanted, and you know, part of what I understand that we are about is trying to learn to be enchanted about the right things, and in a way that I would say that draws us into, you know, communion or love with one another, with true wisdom and with God. So discerning that is can be a challenge, but sometimes being able to name false enchantments is the beginning, you know, of wisdom.
That's a really terrific question, and I guess I would agree with Beth. I think with every good gift, there come responsibilities, and enchantment is a gift. I would say a gift from God. I really liked what Beth said, talking about waiting for gifts as another way of just challenged me to think about the expectation of enchantment is waiting for gifts. And so if we're sitting and paying attention to something, what are we paying attention to? I think that question needs to be asked. I think getting notifications on my iPhone is enchanting. Was enchanting for the first month, and now it leads me to busyness and distraction. And so maybe then I ask myself, what is this for? And why am I doing it?
You mentioned the monks in Nigeria when you were talking about leisure and courage. And I guess I was confused as to how their story demonstrated leisure, because it seems to me more that their practice is for more ritual than leisure. So clarify how that story kind of illustrates leisure and courage.
Great, thank you. I wouldn't make that kind of distinction between ritual and leisure. I mean, I think some rituals obviously can be, not leisurely, but I think that one of the gifts that we have when we have rituals are that they give us space to practice leisure, so we're not just creating it in the moment. And now I did actually learned this from a friend, but in the recent institution where I taught, it was a seminary, I actually developed this liturgy for learning that we followed in my class. So I wanted them to think about the classroom as a kind of ritual liturgy that was taking place. So, yeah, so I think just to go back to the monks, I mean, it was their life together. Some of it was highly ritualized, like their prayers. Some of it was less so, their visitation with their neighbors. But it was that communion that formed them, and that, I would say, that love, really, because they felt like they couldn't abandon their neighbors. That gave them the courage to stay. So does that make sense? Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you both for your lecture today. I have a question first for Dr. Sue, and I'm wondering what you might think of kind of Socrates' way of kind of categorizing some of the disciplines, and especially in the Apology, he kind of talks about how it's very possible for poets and politicians and even mathematicians to be good at their discipline without being good at being human. And so I'm wondering if you could clarify for me if you think that there's something. Does math possess the ingredients in itself to make virtuous people, or are you adding something additional in your pedagogy that would cultivate such virtue? And then the kind of a question for both of you, it seemed that in both of your presentations, there seemed to be at least two kinds of knowledge identified, one being receptive and another being maybe analytical in mathematics. I'm wondering if these are in conflict with each other or if they can be reconciled. Is mathematics, can it kind of fit into Josef Pieper's model of leisure?
So I guess the answer to your first question, or the answer that I would suggest to your first question is depends on what you mean by mathematics. So if you think about mathematics as just a list of skills, then I would say math in itself does not possess within itself the ingredients to make humans more virtuous. But if you think about mathematics as not just a list of skills, but a collection of human practices that are partly culturally defined, then math, the practices of mathematics, the things that I would think of as the discipline of doing mathematics, does possess within those practices the ingredients that can help make people more virtuous. Now, you have to ask yourself, why do those practices have those ingredients? Well, I mean, of course, as a person of faith, I would say that the reason that these human practices have within them an attention to virtue is often comes from meeting the deep spiritual human desires that we all have, and so if these practices have evolved towards good ends, it's because of those things, and those I would say come from God.
I think we might have failed to turn that mic on. Would you mind turning
Hello?
it on? Then we'll get your question on the recording. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Yes. Dr. Sue, thank you for your talk today. My question is, I'd like to ask you if you could to put what you said today in conversation with Dr. Stewart's talk yesterday, just a bit. You've been talking about innate human desires, the way that math can help us to arrive at certain kinds of human goods. And yesterday we heard an interesting argument about the need to have a kind of objectively described notion of the human good. And so I wonder, do you use math in coming to your account of the things that human beings need? And do you think that math has a place in the philosophical question about describing what's good, say, for the species or for us as a community?
Thank you. So first of all, I was not able to get here until last night, so I didn't hear the talk yesterday. But I will infer, based on what you've said, the spirit of your question. And so I think let me see if I can restate your question. So I think you're asking basically, do I think of math as part of the good life for every human being? Is that one way of reframing your question?
It could be, but since my question wasn't fair because you weren't here, let me try it again.
Yeah.
We could say that the good for any given human being is what that human being comes to realize that she might like or want. Or we could say that humanity is a species that has a series of goods that attach to it. And we need to know the answer to that question, was the argument, if I got it right yesterday. That argument is approached philosophically often. And as I listened to you, I wondered if that argument could be approached mathematically. Could we use mathematical thinking and skill sets to bridge the gap between definitions of what it means to be a good person? You've been talking about virtue, for example, and desires.
Mm-hmm.
Does math help you come to that account of what virtue and those desires are?
I'm going to reflect my ignorance of philosophy here, but I think I'm gonna. I think the answer to that question is yes. That I do think that math objectively, in some ways, is an important part of what it means to be human. Doing math in the ways that I've described is objectively an important part of, like, learning to. I think somebody once said that literature is equipment for living, I would say mathematics is equipment for thinking. And all of us think mathematically, whether we realize we're doing it or not. And so yes, I do. I guess I do believe that is objectively something that's worthwhile to do. I'm not sure if I completely answered your question or not, but that's what I'm offering.
I wanted to thank you both for just wonderful and provocative presentations. And the preface to my question is just to simply acknowledge how countercultural I think both of your messages are. And that's really the heart of my question is, how do we resolve this tension that has been present, I think, in all of modern higher education between our call to produce human persons, right, who are flourishing, versus producing professionalized laborers or workers? I mean, I think they're not mutually exclusive, but all of the things that you were suggesting in your talk, they really are kind of going against what society's expectations are for college graduates, or at least stated expectations. And so I'm wondering also about this call as embracing the humanities to transform individuals. You're both kind of talking about transformative aspects of teaching versus how we transform institutions or societies, and what happens when we're transforming the individuals and they're going out into workforce situations in which their workplace is designed to actually limit human flourishing rather than promote human flourishing. I can even think at the highest levels, institutions that disguise, for example, work as play in order to maximize the productivity of workers is to actually confuse the boundary between work and leisure. So any thoughts along those lines, I would love to hear your comments.
Well, it's a great question. And there's a part of me that resonates actually with what Stanley Fish says, that things are so written into the way the university is that it's just going to be very difficult to do otherwise. But I ended with hope. So I think what we're doing here, and I think what I heard both Francis and I also do in our talk, was trying to reimagine the ways we might be in the classroom, or to reimagine the ways we might think about our disciplines. And so I think we can be overwhelmed by the grand picture, and are really called, to attend. I mean, to go back to Simone Weil, to attend to the small ways that we can be faithful, and beyond that, we can't really control it, or else we're going to be guilty of the same thing that knowledge somehow comes purely control. So I mean, I love Teresa of Avila's quote that it's not the greatness of your deed, but it's doing the small thing with great love. So I think that's the the place we need to sort of remind ourselves to dwell. So that's
The tension you described between flourishing and productivity, I think, reflects maybe a larger tension between competing notions of where humans get their dignity, right? So I think on one hand, we as a society value the rich, the powerful, the strong, and the beautiful. And this often causes us to chase after things that we know don't bring us satisfaction. And so on one hand, society doesn't realize that they're playing into this kind of idolatry. On the other hand, I think society does realize that it's important to treat people with dignity in some ways, right? And we do hear people crying for justice. Various kinds of social justice movements are trying to seek dignity for the marginalized, right? And so I think that tension exists partly because humans can't necessarily agree on what gives us dignity. And that notion of dignity, even for people who care a lot about justice, I think often it has to be rooted somewhere, and if it's not rooted in who you are or what if it's not rooted in what you've done, if it's not rooted in your accomplishments or your beauty or the color of your skin or any of these other things, then it has to be rooted in something outside yourself. And of course, people of faith would say it's rooted fundamentally because God has given us infinite worth and dignity that doesn't come from anything we do or any characteristic about ourselves. And so I think that's the tension that really underlies the question of whether we pursue human flourishing towards building up the human potential, because we all have an innate worth and dignity, versus building up humanity to be more productive, which is, I think, moving us towards valuing humans because they can do things or accomplish things for us.
Hi, again, thank you for your talks. And this is primarily directed to Professor Sue. I just was wondering, and you've touched on this in some other ways, but I'd like to hear you address it more directly. You wrote a book, or you've written a book called Mathematics for Human Flourishing, and these different chapters were about meaning, beauty, truth, and so forth. And I guess I can think of like other ways that you can, acquire those virtues other than mathematics. So can you speak to, what do you say to people who ask, what is the thing that mathematics itself specifically brings? Why is it good to study mathematics in itself when you can get these virtues in other ways? Does that make sense?
That's great. Yeah, great question. Yeah, so I'm definitely not making the argument that math uniquely serves as ways to build these virtues. In fact, I do say in the book very strongly that there are lots of ways to build virtue, and you can see in some ways the book is an argument for the liberal arts more broadly. I think there are ways that math offers these virtues uniquely, and so that's part of what I describe. If you are learning to be persistent through struggle, there's a certain kind of persistence and through struggle that you develop by the practice of mathematics, and it's part of the argument for why everybody should learn to do mathematics, is because it's equipment for thinking. Who doesn't want to think more? Who doesn't want to learn to think well in some ways?
Hi, I'd like to ask both of you to speak about classroom practices. And I'd like to ask Francis Sue about, I noticed, for example, the problem that used induction, the method of induction, to prove a sequential formula. And in your presentation, you talked about being captivated by mystery and motivated by questions. And I'm wondering, in the classroom, would you set up the introduction of the method of induction by doing things to elicit questions and motivation of mystery before you actually introduce the method itself or do problems itself? And then Elizabeth Newman, if I could ask you, when you were talking about the liturgy in the classroom, I noticed you did this. I don't know if you noticed yourself doing this, which suggested to me that you've got a bit of a sequence of things that you like to do with your classroom to make it have a certain kind of structure that's a liturgical structure. So I wonder if you could share that with us. Thanks.
Yeah, what I would do with that, and this was teaching theology and ethics primarily, is that I would open with some sort of meditative quotation or possibly a prayer. And the quotation might come from what we were actually studying in the classroom. So, Augustine, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, beautiful. So we would use that as like a prayer or meditation. And I think I would have it like the liturgy, I can't remember how to phrase it, the liturgy of opening. But then I would say the liturgy of study. So I wanted them to think of study also as a kind of liturgy. And that it was, it was very brief. So they each had this, and then I would end it with some sort of blessing when we left. And part of my desire in doing that was to go at cross purposes with this idea that somehow in the classroom, you can't, the classroom is separate from worship, or, this discipline is separate from that. So, so that's what I did.
I like to structure the way that I teach as in the same way that someone would tell a good story. Like, I don't want to give away the punchline. I'd like students to figure it out or come to a realization themselves. This is a so-called aha moment. And in math, we live for the aha moment, like the realization that something fundamentally is true about the universe. Right? That's the experience that's enchanting for mathematicians. And so, when I think about giving a lecture, I try to make it extremely active, very participatory. If I were introducing a topic like induction, I wouldn't say, here's a method of induction. I would say, hey, what would you do if you wanted to prove this statement? Well, okay, yeah, you just verify that it's true. Well, is it true for the next situation or the next one or the next one? Now, what would you try to do if you wanted to show it's true for an infinite number of statements all at the same time? So even in a lecture format, I try to encourage active learning. That's, I think, the word that we use in mathematics and the sciences these days. And research shows that active learning is far better than straight instruction.
This will be our last question. Yes.
Okay, thank you guys so much for coming to present to us today. Professor Sue, you mentioned that creativity and imagination are virtues, and while I'm fully willing to believe that, I was wondering what you think constitutes them as virtues.
I would say what constitutes them as virtues is that they are they reflect the imagination and creativity of our Creator.
That's a really good answer. Thank you.
Straight into the point. All right. Well, will you join me in thanking Dr. Sue and Newman one more time?